Okay. So as you can see, the title is What is Not Patented is Prohibited. And perhaps some of what is patented should be prohibited, but we're not really going to get into that tonight. But the subtitle is Exploitation, Ownership, and Criminalization of Nature. And we're going to talk a bit about biopiracy, which is a term that some of you may be familiar with. It's basically the theft of indigenous knowledge and genetic resources. Indigenous people depend on their biotic environment, their biological resources in their environment. So in some sense, they have built up they've accumulated a store of knowledge about this. And developed nations, so-called developed nations, have historically just come in and taken that knowledge, taken those biological resources, and used them for their own purposes without making much of an effort to give something back. Little reciprocity is going on. We take indigenous knowledge, we bring the plants back, we develop billion-dollar drugs sometimes. Where's the benefit to the indigenous people in all this? It certainly benefits society and the world as a whole, but there's very little effort made to benefit the people that were the stewards of the knowledge and the maintainers of the habitats and the maintainers of the genetic resources. So that's clearly not a good thing. And especially these days, because species are disappearing today faster than ever, faster than any of the great dyings that have happened during the evolution of life. And that's happening mostly because of the impact that we're having on the planet. And there's very little effort made to compensate the host countries, to give them incentives to preserve this genetic diversity, or to compensate the indigenous peoples to preserve the knowledge that, discoveries are made on. So now there's been a backlash as these indigenous cultures become more sophisticated and more, in some sense, aware of what they put up with for so long, and so they're putting restrictions on so-called bioprospecting. And they're saying you can't have access to these genetic resources without you acknowledge something, that you owe something. And so that's actually been a disincentive to the development of new medicines in some ways, because, the indigenous peoples are done with the idea of people exploiting their knowledge. Well, if we look at history, this is nothing new. Biopiracy is nothing new. The European colonists, ever since what's called the Columbian Exchange, ever since Columbus, quote unquote, discovered the New World, and that word alone betrays, how unconscious about this we are. The New World was not discovered until the Europeans got there, even though there were millions of people already living in the New World. Well, they didn't count, right? They didn't discover anything. But here's just a list of some of the things that the New World has given to the Old One. Not necessarily as gifts, but now these things have global importance. Things like chili peppers and potatoes and tobacco, chocolate, coca, pineapple, curares, mate, all of these things, are globally, economically important. They all came from the New World. The indigenous peoples and the cultural context out of which these things came has essentially not benefited from the use of these things. So here's one example, Cinchona officinalis, which is a plant that is the source of quinine. And quinine has anti-malarial properties. And this plant is native to Peru, to the mountains of Peru. In the 18th century, the Jesuit missionaries in the New World were being decimated by malaria. And the Indians of the area, the indigenous people, being very open, told them about quinine or cinchona bark, more like it, as a treatment for malaria, and it's very effective that way. So it got the name fever bark because it's good for fevers. Eventually, it was renamed Jesuit fever bark because they started exporting it by the ton to Europe. It used to be called Indian fever bark. So even that minimal acknowledgement of the indigenous contribution was, went away. And the fact that, essentially the Indians, by sharing their knowledge, gave the European colonists and the Jesuits a way to maintain their foothold in the New World. They were all dying of malaria, and it was going to be difficult to maintain their presence. But because they had the secret of cinchona bark, they could continue to colonize the New World. We repaid the indigenous peoples with basically genocide. I mean, our gift to them was we slaughtered them as much as possible. And we couldn't have done it if they just let things go. All the Jesuits and all the missionaries would have died of malaria, problem solved, but that didn't happen. And all this happened in the early 16th century, the early 1500s, and the Spanish Inquisition was, at its height at that time. The Catholic Church was quite, at the pinnacle of its power. So all these indigenous practices, religious practices, particularly the use of sacred plants, was considered the devil's work, and they made great efforts to stamp that out. And it's very efficient to stamp things out when you kill people, then they really can't practice anymore. So that was the gift that we gave back. In more recent history, we can look at the rubber plant, Hevea brasiliensis, in the late part of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The same kind of atrocities were repeated. The Indians in the Putumayo regions of Peru and Colombia were forced into slavery to harvest the latex from which rubber comes. And what amounted to concentration camps for the Indian collectors were established. And there was the way that the camps were run was you worked literally until you dropped. And then your body was dragged off, I guess, and thrown into the jungle. If an Indian or a worker refused to work this way, put up with this slavery, the bottoms of their feet were cut off. So, this is what we civilized Europeans did when we were dealing with indigenous people. It was almost as though, to us, to European colonizers, these people were not even human, and so we could somehow justify that. This has all been documented in a number of books. As a result of the rubber trade, the rubber barons, so-called, like the oil barons of the same period, lived in the Amazonian cities of Iquitos and Manaus, and lived like kings, sent their laundry to Europe to be done, lit their cigars with $1,000 bills. Money was literally flowing in the streets. The unfortunate part is, so was blood. And it was the blood of the indigenous peoples. So the Amazonian rubber industry collapsed when seeds of the rubber trees were smuggled to Kew Gardens and eventually established in plantations in Asia, where they didn't have to be gathered from the wild anymore. They could just be, cultivated. So that was an act of biopiracy, but it had a slight benefit of putting an end to the genocide that was going on in the Amazon at that time. And, we talk about the great genocidal events of the 20th century. This one doesn't even get on the radar, but this was every bit as bad as, others millions of Indians died as a result of this over the rubber wars. Well, in the contemporary world, in the current world, there's a big trade in botanical medicines and herbal medicines. And if you look around you, you can see a good sampling of those. And there are many businesses that that sell these things. And that's kind of a good thing, because in this crowd, we know that botanical medicines are inherently much safer than pharmaceuticals and often even more effective. So it's not that it's bad, but the exportation of herbal medicines to the first world, to the developed world, means they're less available for use by the indigenous people. And there's an economic incentive, so they make that sacrifice. And so they don't have sufficient supplies of many of these medicines. And that's what they depend on for their basic health care needs. So in some ways, we're stealing from them. We're degrading their quality of life so that ours may be enhanced. And we have a moral obligation to give something back in some ways, to try to right this wrong. And, what are the solutions? The costs of these botanical medicines increases to the point where the local people, can't afford to buy them. And so that degrades their health care. I worked for a company, just so you know, I'm one of the guilty as much as anyone else. I worked for a company called Shaman Pharmaceuticals, started back in the early 90s, and they were developing a drug based on sangre de grado, which some of you who've been to South America know this is an important medicine. It's used for wounds, it's used for ulcers, it's used for many things. One of the miracle medicines of the Amazon. Shaman Pharmaceuticals wanted to develop an antiviral drug based on it. Well, that's wonderful, but they came in and they started buying up all the sangre de grado that was being produced locally. Suddenly the local people don't have it. So net loss from their perspective, from the Western U.S. pharmaceutical exploitation of sangre de grado. And in some ways, it was kind of ironic, because they spent $85 million to develop sangre de grado as a prescription pharmaceutical. They isolated a compound from it, and eventually they made it into a very effective antidiarrheal drug. However, it's no more effective than sangre de grado resin itself, except that you have to pay a lot more for it, and it's a prescription drug. So everybody lost off that deal, except Shaman Pharmaceuticals. They did okay. Kava is another good example of what happens when an indigenous plant, an indigenous medicine, collides with the needs of corporate global exploitation. Kava is a traditional beverage. It has mild anxiolytic properties, muscle relaxing properties, and so on. It's at the center of social life throughout Polynesia. It's as important in their culture as coffee or alcohol is in ours. It's used as a social lubricant. It makes you mellow and relaxed, but it doesn't interfere with your judgment. So it's better than alcohol in that respect. And in Polynesia, everyone drinks kava, and they use it to talk story. Everyone drinks kava, sits around and talks story, as they call it. So kava has a very important position in Polynesian societies. But science discovered that it is, in fact, a very effective anxiolytic and muscle relaxant. And so it became useful as an herb of commerce. And people in these islands like Vanuatu and Tonga and even Hawaii started growing kava to feed the local market. And that was all good. Everyone thought that there was a time when we all thought that kava was going to be the savior of agriculture in Hawaii, which is in a real crisis. After sugarcane, there was nothing to grow. Everyone started putting in thousands of acres of kava, right? And that was going to save Hawaiian agriculture. Well, about that time, several cases of liver problems in Europe surfaced. About 32 people reported liver problems after taking these highly concentrated extracts of kava. And as it turned out, it wasn't really kava at all. It was the way that it was manufactured and concentrated. Kava itself is inherently non-toxic. But it created bad press around kava, even to the point where several agencies or several countries actually banned it. Singapore actually banned it and established the death penalty for possession or use of kava. I don't think most of the rest of the world was that, not quite that draconian, but in other words, so all the investment in kava cultivation that had gone on in Hawaii and in Fiji and Tonga and Vanuatu, these people lost millions because suddenly the market for kava collapsed. And so they had all this kava that they had grown and no place to sell it and not even allowed to sell it. I guess the good news of that, if there is a positive side to that, is suddenly they had plenty of kava to meet their local needs, right? So there's always a silver lining. Now, kava is making a comeback because there was a commission study to look at these case studies about liver damage. There are about 32 reports of liver damage, and the American Herbal Products Association commissioned a review committee, an independent review committee, to look at the toxicology and all the aspects of these reports. And it turned out only 2 of them were linked to kava, with an apparent link to kava. The others were all confounded by other variables, like the fact that the victims had been alcoholics for years and things like that, right? So it wasn't due to kava that the liver... So now kava has been unbanned, actually, by some countries in Europe. It's perfectly okay to buy it, and it's having a bit of a comeback. In fact, prepared the traditional way as a water extract, it's not toxic to the liver or anything like that. You could make a case, in fact, that it's probably good for the liver because there are so many antioxidants in it that protect the liver against damage. But, so now it's come back, and I understand there's even a kava bar that's opened here in Portland. Who's the guy here that works for the kava bar? Anyway, yeah, go to the kava bar. Have a nice cup of kava after the...
I was going to take you there today.
Oh, yeah, we were going to go, but we didn't have time. But the evening is young yet, so... Yeah, well, we might end up there. I wouldn't mind. I love kava, actually. So commercialization of this biodiversity raises some big questions, some troubling questions. Who owns this biodiversity? Who should have the right to profit from this biodiversity? And how can we balance the needs for economic development? How can that be balanced with the need to preserve the species, to preserve the habitats, and to preserve the cultural integrity of the people that have used these plants, of which they're an integral part of culture for thousands of years? Is there any way we can reconcile these different needs? I'm not going to go into this. It's too complicated. But the question is here, so who owns this? Does anyone own this knowledge? And right now, the pharmaceutical and biotech industries are waking up to the fact that the future of drug discovery is in natural products. The future drugs are going to come from natural products. I mean, they wasted 30 years or more thinking they don't need nature. They can synthesize everything. They can just hire a bunch of chemists to make molecules, and we can dispense with nature. Well, as a result, the pharmaceutical discovery pipeline is empty. There are no new drugs, truly new chemical entities being advanced from discovery to the clinic. It's at all-time low, maybe 10 a year. Before, it was like 30 to 40 a year. That's because natural products are the best bet for discovering new effective molecules. Funny how that works. We just happen to have evolved with these medicinal plants. No wonder they work on our system. So now the race is on to identify and patent as many of these plants, genes, novel plant products before the species disappear or their habitats are destroyed, with very little attention being paid to what they should be focusing on is how do we preserve these species? How do we protect these habitats? No, we just have to get it out before we, slash and burn it, basically. So a lot of these discoveries, if not all of them, are based on this accumulated knowledge of indigenous peoples. Does that make them the owners of this knowledge? I don't know. Ownership is a Western concept. A lot of these cultures have no concept of ownership. They have no understanding of money. They have a whole different perspective on that you could claim for yourself a plant and its properties and guard it and put a patent on it. This is an alien notion to these people. So they would never say they're the owners of this knowledge. Should these people be compensated for it? It seems like the right thing to do. How do you find a way to do that? These are people that often can't relate to money, so how can you give them benefit? You can't just pay them money. They won't know what to do with it. Some will, some won't, but there might be better ways to compensate them. And then, so what constitutes good, just compensation? And what about the plants and the organisms? Who owns these resources? Does the government of a biodiverse country like Peru or Brazil, do they own them? Do the indigenous people there own them? Or are they the common heritage of mankind? I think you have to, think about that. If a company patents a gene or a chemical substance, does that mean they own it? Well, a pharmaceutical company, and their lawyers would tell you, absolutely we own it. We have the patent, but they didn't invent it. They may have discovered it, but they didn't invent it. So, do I have an answer to this? No, I don't. I mean, these are complex issues. All I'm doing, I'm just asking the questions. And I think we have to ask some questions, and that's what I'm doing. One example here is ayahuasca. There were attempts in the mid-'80s. There was a company that attempted to patent ayahuasca, and they identified what it might be used for, that it potentially is useful in treating Parkinsonism and angina pectoris, antiseptic properties, antibacterial and amicidal properties, as well as mental illnesses. But all these uses were well known. There's nothing proprietary here. This involved no discovery. This has all been published years before they filed their patent. So what they filed their patent on was the unique physical characteristics of a particular strain of Banisteriopsis. And this was the stupidest patent ever filed, possibly, because it was based on flower color. Flower color is an enormously variable characteristic in almost all plants. And this one had yellow flowers, most of them have pink flowers. This is not the basis for a patent. This is absurd. And in fact, the indigenous peoples didn't think so either. So they actually made a delegation of Amazonian indigenous medicine men who came to the patent office in Washington and protested. They had expert help from scientists who also agreed that there was nothing unique about this variety or this strain of Banisteriopsis. So in an amazing and surprising decision, the patent office overturned this patent in response to their petition, which was the right thing to do. They did. And this is what the indigenous people said. They, the shamans, are also here because they have felt indignation that something sacred to us has become an object of trade. Our shamans, along with hundreds of learned Amazonians, are worried that a handful of men and women are entering our indigenous communities to search for and to appropriate our knowledge. Indigenous peoples from all over the Amazon cannot understand how, given that ayahuasca has served the indigenous peoples and all of humanity to cure and treat hundreds of corporeal and spiritual illnesses, one can ignore the legitimacy of traditional knowledge. And this was just an excerpt from their petition. But it had real impact because the U.S. was about ready to sign a agreement with Ecuador to investigate and develop these biological resources. And Ecuador stepped back and said, no, actually, we're not going to sign that agreement because we've seen the way that you treat our indigenous people. Ecuador is a very, I'd say, advanced country when it comes to recognizing the rights of indigenous people. They're further ahead than Peru or Brazil or any of these others. There are several ways to level the playing field. Now the developed world is beginning to realize that these people will not be exploited. They're smart enough. They have young people who become scientists, who become lawyers, who become politicians, and those people, representatives of their community, come along and say, well, we're not playing this game, and we can file suits too. We can seek protection from the courts. And there's exactly what they're beginning to do. They're beginning to realize that intellectual property resources does apply to genetic resources, that indigenous people have legitimate claims to this intellectual property, that biodiversity has value and host countries have the right to protect them. And collaborative agreements are beginning to be established, and between biotech and pharma companies and government agencies in developed countries. And although we can say a lot of bad things about the U.S. government, one of the good things that they've done is the National Cancer Institute, which has had a natural products discovery program since the mid-'60s, is actually sort of been down this road, and they've learned the lessons, and they're trying to implement, the proper way to do it. So they actually know how to go in and, without making enemies, get access to these genetic resources. And out of that, so they recognize they have an ethical obligation to respect indigenous property and indigenous knowledge. So the National Cancer Institute has been kind of an example of how you can do this. It's not impossible. So one good thing your taxes may do. Another new organization that's just taken form recently, I want to call your attention to it. It's the Ethnobotanical Stewardship Council. And this is a new nonprofit that has just sprung up in the last year or so. And they're focusing right now mostly on what they call the sacred medicines, the entheogenic medicines that are used in indigenous practices, especially ayahuasca. Because ayahuasca, that's their current focus, because ayahuasca is becoming so popular. The populations are threatened. It's a possibility that the supplies may be decimated as it goes global. So the Ethnobotanical Stewardship Council is trying to address that, and these people come out of sort of the NGO environment, emphasizing fair trade, organic, sustainable agriculture, and that sort of thing, and fair trade for the people that are the cultivators of these things. They're just taking that from chocolate and coffee and these other commodities and applying them to the sacred medicines. And so that diagram here shows this is what their kind of three-part mission is. One is to promote sustainable cultivation and good quality of preparations, to promote safe practices in these retreat centers, and to create a environment for a lot of these retreat centers that are operating in Peru, not to impose practices on them, but to hopefully get them to sign on voluntarily to assure clients that they'll be safe, that the medicine will not contain weird things, that women won't be molested, and just some pretty common sense kind of things. This does go on. It all goes on. So these centers, if they buy into this, will then get, essentially, they'll be able to say that the ESC approves of what we do, and maybe that will incentivize other groups to do that. All this is going to be discussed if you happen to be in Ibiza in Spain in late September. There's the World Ayahuasca Conference that this organization has helped organize, where all these issues are going to be discussed in probably exhausting detail. So this is just kind of a summary of that. I had to show you this because this is the best example of PowerPoint animation I've ever done. The drug discovery pipeline is empty, and so the discovery of these new chemical entities is at all-time lows. At the same time, we're burning down the rainforest, and the other sustainable uses of the rainforest are responsible for 20 to 30% of global warming. If we want to stop global warming, we don't need new technologies. All we need to do is put the fires out, because we're releasing gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere as a result of burning the rainforest, and trees are the best technology that exists for the sequestration of carbon out of the atmosphere. So it's a double whammy. And, these unsustainable uses are really important when it comes to emissions of greenhouse gases. Yet we know that the rainforest harbors undiscovered drugs worth billions and probably trillions. We don't know because they're undiscovered, but we know it's huge. At the same time, biopiracy has reduced the incentives for these biodiverse countries to open up their genetic resources to pharmaceutical companies. Why should they? They've always been screwed so far. Possible solution: create an independent, non-profit, for-profit entity to serve as a liaison between biodiverse countries, academic and government research entities, and the global pharma biotech industries. So this is maybe a impractical solution, but it could be implemented through organizations maybe like the UN, would seem to be the logical global organization, to provide host countries with incentives to preserve these habitats, to ensure fair and just compensation for access to the habitats, to enable host countries to develop their own in-country pharma and biotech infrastructure, and to provide incentives and access to the global pharma biotech industry to fill the discovery pipeline and discover the medicines of the future. And in the process, reduce global warming by reducing deforestation, save the rainforest, save the planet. So maybe one possible solution. So I want to go to the second part of this talk. How am I doing for time? Anybody? Is it? Huh? Okay. The second part is somewhat shorter, and it does relate to these issues. But I want to discuss the criminalization of nature. This is the other part of it. So we have here the smallpox virus. And the smallpox virus is, I think it's very nasty. It's a very nasty pathogen, as we all know. And thanks to vaccination programs and public inoculation programs and scientific discovery and all that, the smallpox virus has been completely eradicated from the face of the planet. Of course, there are a few strains kept in deep freezers in the bioweapons laboratories of various governments, but basically it's not out there infecting people. I mean, and it won't be unless these governments decide that, biological warfare is somehow a good thing. So I don't think anyone would argue that the smallpox virus is something that we can pretty much eradicate it, and we should eradicate it because it's a net benefit. To do so is a net benefit to our species, and we've been able to do that. But now the same idea has been applied to various medicinal plants
like opium poppy, coca, and cannabis. We have this idea that, we rule nature, and we can condemn any species we want to extinction if it's inconvenient. And the governments have decided these species don't deserve to exist. So they've created programs to eradicate them completely from the face of the earth. Of course, doomed to failure, but still, that attitude is not. I mean, it's just stupid. But they have that attitude. But these plants, yeah, they can be abused. Any substance can be abused. Anything can be abused. And the answer to drug abuse is education, to teach people how to properly use these substances, not to eradicate these organisms. It's not their fault. God made them to make these alkaloids, and they made us stupid, so we, can abuse the plants. But, in other words, these are valuable medicines, and especially to the indigenous people that use them. I mean, coca, the source of cocaine, but in traditional Andean culture, it's absolutely at the center of Andean culture. It is a sacred plant. It's the whole basis of the Amazonian or the Andean cosmology. It's all about coca. So what gives the DEA the right to try to eradicate coca? I don't think it does. And but they have tried to. They started this program to develop genetically engineered pathogens that will wipe out drug plants such as coca, opium, and cannabis, fungi, pathogenic fungi, genetically developed for this. Problem is they're not that selective for these plants. They also infect crop plants, and they wipe out the food supply of local communities. And their plan, Colombia, involves the dumping of tons of herbicides on these coca and cannabis crops being grown in Colombia. Well, these are toxic chemicals. They drift onto the food crops, they contaminate the water supply, and they contaminate the people. And rates of cancer and birth defects in these communities that are exposed to this are hundreds of times greater than national averages. So in some ways, this is a tragic illustration of the effects of the war on drugs. Wars like this are not on drugs. These wars are on people. And it's people that suffer from these ridiculous government policies. So it's not about genocide. They plan a genocide of plants. What they end up with is a genocide of people, of these indigenous people. So, the government needs to understand, and I think it's getting the lesson sort of shoved into its face with recent developments with cannabis, and, memo to the head of the DEA and everybody else involved, the war on drugs is over. Drugs won. So, let's get used to it. Here's another example. Salvia divinorum. Some of you probably are familiar with this. A lot of times, the businesses like this, ethnobotanical businesses, got their start selling Salvia divinorum, which is a hallucinogenic mint, comes from Mexico. It's been used for centuries in divination by the Mazatec people. And it's extremely potent, and it has very bizarre and very rapid effects when you smoke the leaves. Some of you are smiling, you know from personal experience what this is like. Now, indigenous people would never smoke the leaves. They would consider that an abomination. They chew the leaves, and they know that in their cosmology, Salvia divinorum likes water, it likes coolness, it hates flames. And so to smoke the leaves is an insult to the spirit of the plant as these people see it. Maybe yes and maybe no, but it's certainly, when you smoke the leaves, it has rapid and very impressive and very bizarre effects, right? And so it's become a legal high, but it's been banned by several states now and some countries. So far, only a few states. And the DEA has identified it as a drug of concern
but they haven't banned it on the federal level. Australia has banned it on the federal level. Australia's drug laws tend to be more draconian than ours. But the problem is that when you prohibit a drug like this, you also you make it much more difficult to do research on it. And in the case of Salvia divinorum, it's an extremely interesting, the compounds from it are extremely interesting because of their properties. The main active ingredient is a diterpene called salvinorin A. And salvinorin A it's not a real psychedelic. It's not a true psychedelic, which works on serotonin receptors. It's actually the most selective and most potent drug that interacts with a class of opiate receptors called the kappa opiate receptors. There are 3 kinds of opiate receptors, mu, kappa, and delta. And kappa is the one that salvinorin A interacts with. And interestingly enough, it only interacts with that receptor. So I don't have a laser thing. But what you're looking at in this graph here, this is on the bottom axis. This is different receptors, serotonin receptors, dopamine receptors, et cetera, the opiate receptors. The red blocks in front are LSD. That's what LSD looks like if you screen it against all these different receptors. LSD is what pharmacologists call a dirty drug, meaning it's dirty in that it's not selective for only one kind of receptor, or a few kind of receptors. It hits a lot of drugs. We know that LSD mainly interacts with serotonin receptors. That's where its actions come from. But it hits dopamine receptors and, all kinds, adrenergic receptors and so on. In the back here, the green things, that's salvinorin A. It hits only the kappa receptor and basically nothing else. That's remarkable. I mean, if you were a drug designer and you wanted to use computer-aided drug design to design a synthetic kappa opiate agonist, you couldn't even get close. So ethnopharmacology trumps computer-aided drug design in this case. The person that made this discovery said, if I used computer-aided drug design to try to create a kappa opiate ligand that was that effective, that selective, it wouldn't look anything like salvinorin A. He said, this stuff looks like cholesterol, and it does. I mean, it's quite lipid and lipid soluble, but it has this effect. And it's the most potent psychoactive natural product known. It's effective around 50 or 60 micrograms. So it's right in the same category as LSD, which is not a natural product. It's a semi-synthetic natural products. A lot of interest in salvinorin A for treatment of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, pain, and even Alzheimer's. There's a lot of excitement, and people are now developing analogs of this compound. So the work is being done, but the natural world provided the lead. So another good example here is the one that I think Herb Stomp is. I think it's paying for Herb Stomp, and it's mitragynine, kratom or kratom. I'm not sure how you say it. Mitragyna speciosa. This is a plant from Southeast Asia primarily. Contains alkaloids like mitragynine, and it has a lot of related indole alkaloids. And the mitragynine alkaloids interact with opiate receptors. So it's kind of like opium, but people use it often to taper off opium, to taper off heroin and things like that. It's not like ibogaine, which is a psychedelic that's used to interrupt the addiction program. You can think of mitragynine as kind of a vegetable methadone in some ways. It's a less harmful, less destabilizing. I don't know if is that accurate. Is that a reasonable way to characterize it? You experts here? Yeah, I mean, you can use mitragynine if you're hooked on narcotics, and a lot of people are because of the
overuse of oxycodone mostly these days. So if you're hooked on oxycodone or other opiates and you don't want to be addicted, you can use kratom to taper off, and even if you don't entirely give it up, it's still less harmful. I mean, inherently herbs are less toxic and less harmful. So it's a very useful plant. It's not particularly dangerous. There's no reason why it should not be available. It's an effective treatment for opium addiction. Why wouldn't we want that? And in fact, so far it's still legal, but I guess the FDA has recently banned importation of kratom, and the DEA is considering prohibiting the plant and its alkaloids. And this is just stupid. It uses up resources that could be used in a better way. Kratom is basically a benign plant that's benefiting people. And so it should be available under just it's a basic human right. I believe it's a basic human right to form symbioses with any plant that we want. And that's essentially what the use of a medicinal plant is. It's a kind of symbiosis. And some people get a little bit hooked on that. But it's much easier to discontinue the use of kratom than, say, oxycodone. And then the other element this is where education comes in. You can say, well, you want to use this, here's the safety profile, here's the downside, here's the benefits. Education is far more effective in helping us come to terms with the use of these substances than prohibition does. Prohibition just doesn't work. And you think they would have learned that with alcohol, but they haven't. I don't know. But mitragynine is, and also the other thing is, just like salvinorin A is leading to the development of a bunch of semi-synthetic analogs, so is mitragynine. This is a very interesting molecule because it combines the properties of an opiate as a sedative with a stimulant. At certain doses, it's stimulative. At higher doses, it's more of a sedative. So this is another promising area for drug discovery. And really, a lot of the other alkaloids in mitragynine haven't even been looked at in terms of their pharmacology. Okay, another example here is DMT. DMT and related compounds like 5-methoxy-DMT are everywhere in nature, and yet they're controlled substances. DMT is a Schedule I controlled substance. It is not an exaggeration to say that nature is drenched in DMT. It's found in plants, it's found in fungi, it's found in animals. And the reason for that is it's a very simple compound, 2 steps from tryptophan. Tryptophan is an amino acid that's found in proteins. So tryptophan is universally distributed. Every living thing has tryptophan. 2 trivial steps away from tryptophan, you get DMT. So it's not surprising that there's lots and lots of DMT around. And in many plants. And this is just a list of the families and the genera and the compounds that they're reported to contain. And the numbers in parentheses are the number of species in that genera, in that genus. So Azoaceae, the genus Delospermum, there are 130 species. Probably all of them contain DMT. And you can just go down the list. Acacia is another in the legume family, the Fabaceae. The acacia is a notorious form of source of some of the strongest natural sources of DMT on the planet are acacias. Some of these acacias have 2% DMT makes up their biomass. And there are 1,200 species of acacia. And so they, probably half of them have DMT in them. Australia recently banned the acacias. They just banned all acacias, which is kind of silly because, yeah, right. I mean, and acacia is the national tree of Australia. So the Aussies, I love them, but they need to wise up. So this is a partial list. Here's the rest of the list. All of these plants in these families contain DMT. Pandanaceae, 600 species. Psychotria, which is Psychotria viridis, is the source of chacruna, contains DMT. There are 1,400 species of Psychotria. Probably half of them contain DMT. So if the DEA or anybody else wants to control DMT, they basically have to criminalize all of nature. I mean, I personally, knowing the chemistry of DMT and how it's biosynthesized, I personally believe that all plants contain DMT. And you could, if you applied sensitive instrumentation to them, you could find DMT in all plants because it's just a fact of biochemistry that the enzymes in cells that convert tryptophan to DMT are everywhere in nature. They're in animals, fungi, and plants. So there's DMT in all plants. Some of them happen to overexpress DMT, and those are the ones that we find useful as sacred medicines. Some of you are aware probably of recent reports. You notice the Rutaceae here, the family Rutaceae. Limonia, Vepris, Xanthoxylum, Dictyoloma. About 3 papers recently came out. The hottest, newest source of potent plant source of DMT in high levels happens to be oranges, lemons, and limes. The seeds contain high levels of DMT, 5-methoxy-DMT, and N,N,N-trimethyltryptamine. So, take that, DEA. Try and control your orange crops. It's actually possible to calculate based on the acreage of citrus cultivation in places like Florida. Knowing the levels of DMT in the seeds, you can calculate how many megatons of DMT they're producing. No, farmers don't know this, but in fact, if they did happen to know it, they might do something illegal. But of course, that would never happen. So another example is cacti. Cacti, mescaline, is not nearly as widespread in nature as DMT. It's a more complicated molecule, and the general rule is more complicated a molecule is, the farther away it is from so-called primary metabolic pathways, the rarer it will become. But mescaline is still pretty common. It occurs in the cactus family, not outside the cactus family, as far as anyone knows. But there are at least 30 species of cacti that contain mescaline. It's not just peyote and Trichocereus or San Pedro. There are 30 species. Many of these, you can just go to your local nursery and buy them. It's mescaline is a controlled substance. Cacti are not. So you can just buy, you can say, hey, man, I'm into ornamental cacti. You got a problem with that? And you can just buy those things. And for some reason, they know this, but they haven't made a great effort to prohibit these cacti. San Pedro cactus is legal. I suppose if you extracted mescaline from it, or if you bought a Trichocereus at your local nursery and had the intent to isolate mescaline from it, that would be illegal. So when you go up there and they say, son, what are you going to use this cactus for? You can say, well, I have a greenhouse, I'm ornamental cacti. Or if you're going to extract mescaline from it, you kind of look at the floor and say, nuttin', I don't know. Anyway, that's another example. Here's a molecule that's basically all over the place. So here's an example of how stupid this can get. A few years ago, there was a bill proposed in the Louisiana legislature. And that tells you right now, we're in stupid territory. Apologies to anyone from Louisiana, but I tell you, your legislators, need to have their heads examined. So they proposed this bill, which said, controlled substances prohibits the production, manufacture, and distribution of hallucinogenic plant products. An act to enact RS 40.989.1 relative to controlled dangerous substances, to create the crime of the unlawful production, manufacture, distribution, or possession of a material, compound, mixture, or preparation intended for human consumption which contains a hallucinogenic plant. Hallucinogenic plant not defined, really. It shall be unlawful for any person knowingly or intentionally to produce, manufacture, distribution, or possess with intent to produce, manufacture, or distribute a material, compound, mixture, or preparation intended for human consumption which contains a hallucinogenic plant, right? So along with this bill, they gave us a list of putative, suspected hallucinogenic plants, most of which you probably never heard of, right? And unless you're really into this stuff. And then if you are, you'll realize that this list came from a review paper on hallucinogenic plants written by Schultes. He's written many of them. But R.E. Schultes, the famous Harvard botanist and the world's expert on hallucinogenic plants, has written many reviews on hallucinogens, and usually includes a section in those reviews that talks about suspected hallucinogenic plants, plants for which we think they might be hallucinogenic based on their indigenous use. We don't know, but we suspect it. So he comes up with, and some legislator, the guy that drafted this bill, whose qualifications were nil to make any judgment on this, I believe he was a plumber. No insult to plumbers here, but, you know, but this is the list of some of the plants that they wanted to ban under this bill, and only a partial list, right? So I saw this and I got really incensed. So I wrote a letter to the Louisiana legislature, and here's some extracts from my letter. I said, as an ethnobotanist who has been studying the uses of medicinal plants for over 30 years, I am writing to urge you to withdraw your ill-considered bill currently under review by the Judiciary Committee and the Louisiana legislature. This bill is not only unconstitutional, but also unenforceable. The bill is tantamount to an attempt to criminalize all of nature. Biologically active substances, some of which are psychoactive, permeate the biosphere, and especially the plant and fungal kingdoms. It's a fact of nature, and we might as well get used to it. Many of the plants on the list have no identified chemical markers, and in many cases, reports of their alleged psychoactivity is based on anecdotal reports of dubious reliability. Most of these plants are rare endemics native to the Amazonian rainforest, not usually encountered by North American botanists. The forensic problems alone faced by any prosecutor in establishing the botanical identity of the plants in question are daunting, requiring the expertise of teams of botanists and pharmacognosists. Needless to say, this is likely to lead to some complications when it comes to the enforcement of this provision. This bill does nothing, nor can it, nor should it, to address the potentially thousands of plant species that contain undiscovered hallucinogenic or psychoactive compounds. Are we going to preemptively prohibit all of these species as well? How will we know them when we find them? It has been estimated that only about 10% of the 250,000 known plant species have ever been investigated for their chemical constituents. It is certain that as science continues to explore plant medicines, new psychoactive compounds will be discovered. Some of them may well prove to have useful medical applications, yet this bill will discourage and in some cases prohibit research that may eventually enable such discoveries. This bill is short-sighted in the extreme and moreover is impossible to enforce, given the technical difficulties alluded to above. The legislators should find better things to do with their time than criminalizing plant species that are endemic to another continent. So here's final issues to ponder, some of which we addressed today, but not all of them. You know, partly one of the issues that we have to face in science is the issue of hubris. we think that science is very powerful, and it is, but we overestimate its limitations sometimes. So there's this attitude on the part of science that, we can do anything because we're scientists. No, there needs to be an ethical limit on some scientific things. Like, an extreme example of this is, for example, and I'm all for this research, but an extreme example is work that's going on with Large Hadron Collider and the discovery of the Higgs boson and all that. There is a very, very, very small but non-zero probability that by mucking around with the structure of space-time on this level, we could collapse the whole shooting match. And so instead of saying, well, maybe we shouldn't do this, because there's a really small chance, but it could happen. Instead, they say, well, in the interest of science and the discovery of knowledge, we'll go ahead and do the experiment, and so we do that. We scientists arrogate to themselves the right to do things that, may be ethically questionable in the service of the search for knowledge. I mean, I'm all for new knowledge, but I'm also for ethics. So that's a part of it. Greed is also a part of this, and that emerges from the notion that we own nature. Nature exists for us to exploit. And we know there are trillions of dollars waiting to be made by the first people that patent genes or synthetic life forms. We know that, the ultimate goal of this is to corporatize nature, to just make it another commodity that belongs to the global, corporate hegemony. And the third issue is control. It's like, if we can't patent it, we will prohibit it. If corporations can own it, then, you and you and you and me, we can't use those because we're violating patents. So they assert the right to control and prohibit all of these natural medicines that includes the psychoactive medicines and the sacred medicines. Ultimately, where this is going, and this is the slippery slope that we're on, where this is going is the state asserts the right to control consciousness itself, what we are permitted to experience. And, George Orwell in 1984 talked about the thought police. We're there, people. We are totally there. And these sacred plants, these psychoactive plants, I often tell people, think of those as our bioweapons. We can fight back, and these plants are important tools. I don't like the word weapon, but in a sense they are weapons to fight this global hegemony. It's not only a war on drugs, it's a war on consciousness. It's saying certain states of mind people should not be prohibited to have. And I think it will be very interesting in the next 10 years or so as they develop neurotechnologies that can induce altered states that probably make psychedelic states seem tame. What are they going to do with those technologies? Are they going to ban those technologies? Or many would like to, because as we know, I think most people in this room know that, the war on drugs is really a war on people, and it's a war on ideas. The reason psychedelics are dangerous is because they give you funny ideas. They give you unconventional ideas. They enable you to question authority and wonder, what is really going on? Why do I have to aspire to work in a cubicle all my life so that I can retire and have my pension taken away? And why serve these kinds of corporate masters? So how do we use these plants, these bioweapons in this way? How can we fight back? I think the way you fight back is you do what plant people have always done. You do what they've always done. They grow gardens. They trade plants. They teach each other how to use them, how to prepare them, how to grow them. They share knowledge. Plants want to spread. That's what plants do. They need our help. That's part of the symbiotic equation, part of the symbiotic relationship. So, this revolution does not involve guns. It doesn't involve violence. None of those things. It involves trading your favorite cuttings over the back fence teaching your neighbors how to grow them so they can teach their neighbors how to grow them. It involves emulating what we see happening with ayahuasca, as it moves out of its endemic home into the world. It got there by simply making friends with people. And people like it, they value it, and they pass it around. And now it's gone global. So if that can happen with ayahuasca in less than 40 years, probably started in the mid-70s with the first plants exported to Hawaii, we can do it with other plants. And so the answer is to form, to take your symbiosis with plants seriously. Grow them, share them, teach people how to use them in a safe way and in a way that is spiritually satisfying. And, we can't lose. In fact, we better not lose because all life on Earth depends on plants. So, we are on the right side of this. And the death culture, can be put on notice that, their days are numbered. So that's the end of my talk. Yeah, thanks. Hot in here, isn't it?
Yeah.
Should we take a break?
Yeah.
What time is it? 8:30. Huh? Yeah, let's go outside and get some air. Maybe we won't have a reading after. We'll see.